More financial trouble for Russia today, trying to make payments in rubles instead of dollars.
Russia has defaulted on its foreign debt for the first time in more than 100 years.
In Russia, people are lining up to make cash withdrawals. They're worried about getting money from banks while they still can. Russia's top bank is quitting. Sberbank blames big cash outflows and threats to its staff and property.
Russia's banks are failing. The top banks are warning that they might need to be bailed out in the next 12 months. Meanwhile, the central bank is printing insane amounts of rubles to keep the government afloat. And it's not surprising. Russia is starting to pay the price of years of war and sanctions. And this price might be too high for the regime to bear. Before we take a deep dive into the Russian banking system, though, let's first understand some of the big problems in the Russian economy, because banks only suffer when the rest of the economy does. One of the big problems in Russia is sky-high inflation. The inflation rate hit 8.4% in 2024 and is now nearing 10%. Simply put, prices for everyday goods like food, fuel, and utilities are soaring. This means Russians are paying more for less, and their money doesn't stretch quite as far. For the average person, especially pensioners, this is a real struggle. But the inflation rate is also strangling many businesses. They face higher costs for materials and labor, so they could get in serious trouble down the line. Now, it's obvious how this relates to banks, as we'll cover later. When households struggle with the cost of living, they also struggle to pay their mortgage payments or the interest on their credit cards. And when businesses struggle with inflated business expenses, they also struggle to repay their loans. Now, one of the major reasons for Russia's soaring inflation rate is the severe labor shortage that's plaguing the country. It's a combination of demographic issues, emigration, and effects of the ongoing war. Russia's population has been declining for years due to low birth rates. In 2024, birth rates hit a 25-year low at 1.2 million, while deaths rose to 1.8 million. Meanwhile, Russians are getting older and older, and more people are retiring. This means there are fewer working-age people to support the economy. On top of that, the war in Ukraine meant that hundreds of thousands of Russians have been recruited for military service or have fled the country to avoid conscription. The shortage of labor has driven up wages, which in turn increases production costs for businesses and leads to more expensive goods and services. But labor shortages aren't the only factor here. Another critical driver for inflation in Russia is the government's massive spending on the war in Ukraine. In 2024, Russia's defense budget was approximately $140 billion, accounting for 35% of all government spending. This year, it's going to be even higher, with plans to spend 6.3% of GDP on national defense. This is unsustainable, because it's overheating the economy and straining the Russian government's finances. To fund the war effort, the government has been tapping into its National Wealth Fund, which is designed to support the pension system and to stabilize the economy during crisis. Before the war, it had $113.5 billion in liquid assets, but now it's down to just $36 billion. The fund is at risk of depletion by 2026. On top of that, Russia's energy revenues, which have traditionally been a major source of income for the Kremlin, have been declining due to sanctions and lower global energy prices. So the government has resorted to debt to fund its war effort. In 2024, the Kremlin ran at a deficit of $34 billion, or 1.7% of GDP. And this year, it's getting worse. Most of this debt is financed by the Central Bank of Russia, which can essentially print money out of thin air just like any other central bank. But there's a caveat. Printing money increases the money supply without actually increasing the amount of goods and services available in the economy. And this leads to inflation. Think of it like more money chasing the same amount of products, but in Russia's case, fewer products because sanctions have crippled imports. Ordinary Russians didn't ask for collapsing banks or endless wars, but they're the ones paying the price. And if you believe these stories deserve to be told, hit like and subscribe. Your support helps these truths reach further, beyond the silence. However, a deficit of 1.7% of GDP isn't that much, especially considering Russia has relatively low government debt of about 21% of GDP. The thing is, this money printing is not just happening through the government. Actually, the government is also forcing companies to take on more debt to finance the war. And it's forcing banks to loan them this money regardless of their credit situation. Since the start of the war, corporate debt went up by an unprecedented $415 billion. And that's not because borrowing suddenly became so attractive. Defense contractors alone have gotten $250 billion in debt this way. The advantage of this is that it's off the government's books, which makes defense spending seem lower than it actually is. But in the end, it does have an effect on the money supply. According to Ukrainian Foreign Intelligence Services, Russia's money supply increased by 24.4% in 2022, 19.4% in 2023, and 19.2% in 2024. Now, we've already covered the inflation that this is causing, but there's a third aspect to this, namely interest rates. Inflation would have gotten way worse if the Central Bank of Russia hadn't responded by increasing interest rates. Ever since 2023, Russia's benchmark interest rates have jumped from 7.5% to 21%, the highest figure since Soviet times. It's at 20% now. Insanely high if you compare that to the 4.5% you have in the US. This makes saving very financially rewarding, while credit becomes incredibly expensive. Eventually, the goal is to cool down the economy, cut back on the money supply, and get inflation back to 4%. However, when the government keeps printing money or keeps forcing companies to take on loans, high interest rates won't work. And with the continued war in Ukraine, it doesn't seem like that government spending is going to slow down anytime soon. Meanwhile, there is a price to pay for Russia's high interest rates. It's leading to economic stagnation and perhaps even an economic crisis. On paper, the Russian economy has been growing just fine over the last few years. For both 2023 and 2024, GDP growth has been 4.1%. But almost all of this was related to Russia's war economy, not the real economy. According to the Wilson Center, Russia is now in a two-speed economy, with non-military sectors stagnating. And because of high inflation, labor shortages, and high interest rates, this non-military sector is really struggling. Many small and medium-sized enterprises are even threatening to go under. In the first quarter of 2025, Russian companies had to pay 3.7 trillion rubles, or nearly $50 billion, on interest payments. That's up 58% from last year. For 2025 total, the business interest costs could go up to 15 trillion rubles, or $172 billion. The reason for this massive increase is that over 55% of corporate loans in Russia have floating interest rates, meaning they change based on market interest rates. And that can go very wrong quickly if rates are sky high, like they are right now. That's why government advisors in Russia are warning of a bankruptcy wave for 2025, with 20% of companies already in risky territory. If they all go bankrupt, it's not only a terrible disaster for the general economy, but also for the Russian banks. They won't be seeing their money back, and they will start to get into serious liquidity problems. Meanwhile, the Central Bank of Russia is caught between a rock and a hard place. They need to lower interest rates to save these businesses, but they need to keep them in place to prevent hyperinflation. Recently, it has already lowered interest rates from 21% to 20% to give businesses some headroom, but that's only a very small adjustment and probably all the room it can give for the moment. So it's not hard to see why the people at the Russian banks are worrying right now. And all this comes against the backdrop of 3 years of sanctions that have crippled the banking sector. Russian banks have been cut off from international payment systems like SWIFT, which makes it incredibly hard to do transactions for imports or exports. Many Russian banks have also got sanctioned by the US, the EU, and others, meaning they can't do business with most of the financial world. Some banks even got their foreign assets frozen, especially the Central Bank of Russia, which lost access to around $300 billion of euro and dollar bonds. Most of it is being managed in Belgium now, and the returns are being sent to Ukraine. Without all these foreign reserves, it's very difficult for the central bank to protect the Russian financial system from shocks. Another terrible effect of the sanctions is that people want to sell their rubles and move money into offshore accounts. This leads to capital flight, which is a problem for banks because they don't have enough foreign currency to give to all their clients. The Kremlin responded by enforcing strict capital controls. People can't convert all their rubles anymore, and businesses with foreign currency reserves are forced to convert it into rubles to prop up the currency. Although this might be a quick and easy fix, it's just one of the many fronts where the banks are getting in trouble. The sanctions and the general problems in the economy, like inflation and high interest rates, are all adding up. Understanding all of this, we can start to see why banks in Russia are in big trouble and why they're worrying about a potential collapse. Now, if really big banks collapse, they can take down the whole economy with them, and that's a serious problem for Putin's regime. So it's worth looking at this in detail. Russia has 13 banks that the central bank calls systemically important lending institutions, basically banks that are too big to fail. The biggest of all is Sberbank, a majority state-owned bank that owns a third of all bank assets in Russia. The second biggest, VTB Bank, is also a majority state-owned. And the third biggest is Gazprom Bank, not a state-owned bank, but owned by Putin's oligarch friends. From this alone, it's pretty obvious that the Russian banks are in the hands of Putin, either through the government or through his cronies. They're tools for him to control the Russian economy. But recently, Bloomberg reported that at least 3 of the 13 systemically important banks might need to be recapitalized in the next 12 months. In non-finance terms, they might run out of money and need help to prevent a collapse. This can actually happen with banks, because they use the money from their depositors to give to borrowers. And if the borrowers weren't able to give the money back, the bank doesn't have the money to give to its depositors, and it's in trouble. A key metric is the percentage of non-performing loans, basically the number of borrowers that are not meeting their payments anymore. At Russia's second largest lender, called VTB Bank, 5% of loans to individuals are already non-performing, and it's rising rapidly. And officially, 4% of total corporate loans in the Russian banking sector are also non-performing right now. But here's the thing, that's not very bad for historical standards. If you look at the historical ratio of non-performing loans in Russia, it's nearly hit 10% during the post-2008 crisis, and it rose to double digits during a crisis in 2017 and 2018. Compared to these years, the Russian banking sector seems pretty healthy. This is also true if you look at profits. Over 2024, Sberbank had 1.5 trillion rubles in profit, or about $19 billion. And currently, the Russian banks have plenty of reserves, with 8 trillion ruble, or over $100 billion, ready to give back to their depositors when they need it. That's why the central bank governor in Russia says that the Russian banking sector is well capitalized, and the people don't have to worry. However, this is very misleading. Russian banks are worried because the quality of their loans is far worse than what the official data are saying. We also have to remember that most banks listen to what the Kremlin wants. And the Kremlin has done all kinds of things to prop up the banking sector, mainly through promoting debt restructuring. Basically, debt restructuring means that banks change the terms and conditions on their loans to make it easier for borrowers to pay them back. Banks can reduce interest rates, give the borrower more time, or exchange debt for equity in the business. But the sneaky thing is that this allows banks to change their accounting. Non-performing loans can be restructured, and suddenly they're turning into performing loans. This lowers the non-performing ratio, but in reality, the bank is still in a very dangerous situation. Now, the reason why the Russian government would want to keep the solution is very simple. If people knew how bad the banks were doing, they would want to withdraw all of their savings. This creates what is called a bank run, where people race to get their money out before the bank collapses. And by that point, a bank collapse is already inevitable, because there's no way the bank has the reserves to get the money for all of its clients. This nearly happened in 2022, right after the invasion happened, because many Russians lost their trust in the banks. So perception is everything here, and Putin would like to keep the perception of stability to prevent a major crisis. However, warnings of a new possible bank run are growing. Russia's Center for Macroeconomic Analysis and Short-Term Forecasting said that the risk of a bank run is spiking. In the end, they can't delay an inevitable crisis forever, and it's interesting to look at what might happen next. As far as financial crises go, there are some patterns that always seem to repeat themselves. First of all, when a bank that's too big to fail is on the verge of collapse, they're always bailed out. This is a pretty complicated process, but essentially, either the government or the central bank gives them money. When the government does this, it's funded by the taxpayer or with national debt. And when the central bank does this, it's funded with money printing. Now, we don't have to look far to find historical precedents for this, even in Russia. Back in 2017 and 2018, during a time of financial trouble for Russia, the central bank bailed out 3 of some of the largest private banks in the country. In the process, the banks were put under state control through the central bank's banking sector consolidation fund. One of the banks was actually repurposed to service the Russian defense sector. However, the total price tag was more than 1 trillion rubles, equivalent to tens of billions of dollars. Those rubles were effectively created out of thin air by the central bank. When many new rubles are created, this can cause inflation and a financial shock. However, because the banks weren't that big compared to the size of the total banking system, it wasn't a huge deal. It was nothing compared to the bailouts handed out during the global financial crisis of 2008 to 2009, which led to the Great Recession of Russia. Some of Russia's biggest banks began to struggle with liquidity, including Sberbank, VTB Bank, and the Russian Agricultural Bank. In total, Russian banks got more than $200 billion in support from multiple sources, including the government, the VEB Bank, chaired by President Putin himself, and the central bank. This was a huge bill to pay, because it was well over 10% of Russia's GDP at the time. It depleted government reserves and caused a high inflation rate of 14%, eating away at people's purchasing power. nobody wants a repeat of this. But the worst disaster of all was arguably the 1998 financial crisis in Russia. Incombank, the second largest commercial bank in Russia at the time, actually collapsed. And this time there wasn't even a bailout. Other commercial banks like Tokobank and Minatep Bank also went bankrupt. This meant that many Russians lost their savings. And for the Russians that kept their savings in state banks, it wasn't much better. Because of the huge financial crisis, the ruble lost 2/3 of its value, and the inflation rate reached 84%. The government also went bankrupt on its debt, and this meant that things like healthcare, education, pensions, public sector wages were severely underfunded. Now, it's difficult to say whether a new Russian banking crisis will be more like the one in 2017, the one in 2008, or perhaps even the one in 1998. That's mostly because official figures don't show how badly the banks are actually doing. For now, we can only say that Russian banks will fall. The only question is how hard. But it's interesting to speculate. Vladimir Putin probably won't allow one of his vital banks to go under, so it's almost certain that there will be bailouts. And because the government is already running tight financially, it will most likely lead to money printing. The total price tag can run into the trillions of rubles, equivalent to tens if not hundreds of billions of dollars. Of course, this depends on how many loans are actually non-performing, which is anybody's guess at this point. To prevent mass bank runs, Putin could set up daily withdrawal limits from households, and he could use his state forces to prevent mass unrest and riots. That's where it could start to get ugly. Bailing out banks could fuel inflation because it expands the money supply. Higher inflation puts pressure on households and businesses through higher cost of living and business expenses, which makes it tough to meet debt payments. And this could cause even more loans to become non-performing, which gets banks in trouble once again. And that's how Russia could end up in a full-on financial crisis if this is not contained. But even in the more moderate scenarios where banks stay stable after the bailout, the money printing that's used will inevitably mean that the ruble loses value. Things like housing and food will get more expensive, and the quality of life for ordinary Russians will get worse one way or the other. So if there's one thing to be learned from this banking crisis, it's that the bill always comes due. Putin can try to turn his country into a war machine, but that will always come at the cost of ordinary Russians. Now, if you want to keep informed on topics like these, please subscribe to the channel. And that being said, thanks for watching.